is yours.
Thank you very much. No trouble at all to come to Rome at this time of the year with this weather. It's a pleasure. And thank you for the invitation to this high-level dialogue. All that is connected with the Mediterranean region strikes a special chord in the souls of Europeans, and Russians are not an exception. The region witnessed the dawn of civilization, the development of culture and knowledge, the birth of great religions. Its special way of life attracts people from the four corners of the world, as it were, and as scientists say, brings health and longevity. But it was also swept by great conflicts and wars, and throughout the history was a stage of contention between rivaling powers. Unfortunately, the modern times heralded for this region not peace and prosperity, but more instability and destruction. We need to understand why the events took the negative turn, and what should be done to overcome the current crisis. From the history of the Roman Empire, one can get the impression that the Romans did not aspire to acquire new lands on the southern shore of the Mare Nostrum, as much as they strived to block the threats emanating from those territories and through them from the African inland. Then came the age of colonialism, when the European powers tried to directly control Africa and the Middle East. But recently it looks as if the old paradigm was returning, with the northern shore of the Mediterranean seeing the utmost priority in fending off the menace from the south. The world, however, has become too interdependent to hope that security could be ensured by building fences on the borders or sending navy out to sea. I believe it is broadly understood that the unprecedented migration crisis plaguing European states cannot be resolved unless there is a marked improvement of the situation in the countries that are now the source of the exodus. This is not to say that no attempts have been made to devise ways and means to ameliorate the state of affairs in the Mediterranean region. Various dialogue formats were created to promote development and cooperation, but all of them were far from being effective. The goal of peace and sustainable growth in the region remained elusive. During the Cold War, many believed that the standoff between the two superpowers was mainly responsible for the enduring conflicts in the Middle East. However, those conflicts, the Israeli-Palestinian one in the first place, turned out to be too complex and deep-rooted to be cured by the end of the bipolar international system. And it is now evident that the methods employed in dealing with that impasse were completely ineffective. The notion that the internal setup in Arab countries could be remodeled at will by outside forces was a product of misplaced unipolar ambitions and end-of-history attitudes. That notion was at the core of the negative trend unraveling in the Middle East and North Africa area and threatening to spiral completely out of control. It began with the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which was carried out despite our European and Arab warnings. It continued with the so-called Arab Spring, when our Western colleagues encouraged democratic revolutions disregarding political realities, culture, and traditions of the Arab societies. In their reformist zeal, NATO members went to the point of open military intervention in Libya and blatant violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. Yet the Arab peoples wanted change, but they did not want death, destruction, and collapse of their economies, their homes, and their countries caused by interference from abroad. What they needed was not revolutions and wars pushing their countries backwards in their development by decades, but evolutionary transformations aimed at gradually modernizing their political and socio-economic systems. Democratic reforms should have been allowed to develop inside the Arab societies at a pace chosen by the people themselves. The unfortunate result of the ideologically motivated external support of the revolts in the Middle East and North Africa was a rapidly widening space of chaos. Some say promoting chaos may be a strategy to make outside control easier. If so, it doesn't bode well, at least for the Europeans. In Libya, state structures practically ceased to exist. We wholeheartedly support UN-led efforts to assist national reconciliation in Libya, and will do our best to contribute to the conference that is convened in Rome after tomorrow. The growing instability in the region was deftly used by the extremist and terrorist groups. In Syria and Iraq, ISIL occupies large territories and tries to create a quasi-state, a caliphate, which in the terrorist dreams would stretch from Portugal to Pakistan. Radicals commit barbaric acts of violence, are engaged in beheading people, hostage-taking. They make life impossible for everyone who does not share their murderous ideology. And they demeanor Islam as a great world religion. No one should make a mistake of believing that terrorists can be used for whatever political purposes. For example, a regime change in Damascus or elsewhere, and can be later swept away from the chessboard. Surely they accept financial, military, and any other aid they can get, but they are ready to turn their back on their sponsors at any moment when they deem it necessary. We have seen it in Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda, and we will see it again. These people have no moral restrictions, as was manifest in the horrible terrorist act they perpetrated against the Russian airplane over Sinai, against ordinary civilians in Paris and elsewhere in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the United States. Indiscriminate killing is their main weapon, and they will not hesitate to continue to use it. So what we need most at this juncture is a clear-eyed approach towards the developments to the south of Europe's boundaries. We must realize that we are facing a dangerous and ruthless enemy who can be defeated only by collective coordinated efforts involving all players both inside and outside the Middle East region. We should never underestimate the trouble terrorists can bring to all our countries employing modern technology. And we should not forget that there are many thousands of fighters in the ranks of ISIL and other terrorist groups who come from abroad, including the European Union countries, Russia, and our neighbors. Recollecting the anti-Nazi alliance is more than appropriate. That is what President Putin meant when he came forward with his initiative to form a broad anti-terrorist front. We firmly believe that everyone should accept this as the foremost priority, putting aside all secondary consideration. I will give you just one example. In Libya, despite a total UN arms embargo, some countries were openly supplying weapons to anti-Gaddafi opposition, including Islamists. But in a short while, those very people, with those very weapons, were among the radical rebels who wanted to seize Bamako in Mali, and the French had to engage their troops to defend the Malian capital. Just imagine what kind of challenge we would all face if ISIL or Nusra managed to occupy Damascus or another capital in the Middle East, what boost it would give to the extremist ideology. And who would then send armies to liberate those cities? That is why we were and remain convinced that trying to weaken both the terrorist and the Syrian government is a dubious strategy. It is quite evident that ISIL will not be defeated by airstrikes alone, and the Syrian army is a main force fighting the terrorists on the ground. Hence the decision to send Russian warplanes to Syria in response to the request from Damascus. And we believe that all forces that can be instrumental in fighting ISIL, including the Syrian army, the Kurdish militias, moderate groups of the Syrian opposition, and all those who are ready to help the ground operations from the air, should join the fight. Making an anti-terrorist struggle successful means ending double play and any support to the extremists, not to mention protection of terrorists as it happened on the 24th of November when the Russian bomber on a counter-terrorist mission was attacked. The international community cannot close its eyes when somebody is playing a role of an accomplice of ISIL, providing to the terrorists, among other things, weapons, transit facilities, and having commercial deals with them. We insist that all this be stopped. And there is a growing demand that the Syrian-Turkish border must be closed as an immediate step. Certainly for the fight against terrorists to be won, the military action must be coupled with the political process. Russia was at the forefront of efforts to define the principles on which the international community could lean in order to assist a negotiated solution of the Syrian crisis. These principles are reflected in the Geneva Communique, which was endorsed by the UN Security Council, and have been further developed in two Vienna documents. We want to see Syria as a sovereign, unified, non-sectarian, secular state where all ethnic or religious groups enjoy equal rights and opportunities. The key to success is unconditional respect of the main principle embodied in the Geneva and Vienna agreements. The future of Syria can be decided only by the Syrian people themselves. As agreed in Vienna, we should now cope with a two-pronged task to help the Syrian opposition to form a truly inclusive delegation for the talks with the Syrian government, and to define a list of terrorist organizations that are to be defeated by joint efforts and shall not be part of any ceasefire or political process. The war on terrorism is also being waged in the hearts and minds of people. No effort should be spared to demonstrate that terrorism has nothing to do with promoting genuine religious belief or with defending the rights of a confession. The radicals should be proclaimed outcasts of any faith. At the same time, the real religious values are to be upheld. In Russia, we have a rich experience of people of different confessions, including Orthodox Christians and Muslims, living together for centuries. We should not overlook the profound dangers of sectarian strife in the Middle East, be it between Muslims and other confessions or inside Islam. We must work together to help turn rivalry between the Sunni and the Shia into reconciliation and productive cooperation on the basis of the well-known Amman Declaration of 2007. In this context, building bridges between Saudi Arabia and Iran is of utmost importance, as is the goal of promoting confidence and security in the Gulf region. And of course, the plight of the Christians as well as other religious minorities in the Middle East should be always on our minds. The exodus of the Christians is a tragedy not only for them, but for the whole region, which is in danger of losing its unique multicultural nature, its role of a beacon of spirituality for different faiths. We believe that in the 21st century, as the world is rapidly changing and new centers of economic growth and political influence emerge, the underlying principle should be the partnership of civilizations. Everyone has to accept the right of others to be different and to promote the culture of compromise. Russia is convinced that the developments in the region should be considered in the entirety and complexity, instead of trying to approach different issues on a piecemeal, simplistic basis. That was the premise of the Security Council Ministerial convened by Russia last September to discuss the problems of the region in a comprehensive manner. We must be consistent in Syria, Libya, Yemen, and other existing and potential hotspots. And of course, we must overcome the impasse on the Palestinian issue. There is no doubt that arriving at long last at a sustainable, just and comprehensive two-state solution would do a lot to diffuse the narrative of the extremists and undermine the ideology and recruiting potential. Last but not least, uprooting terrorism involves efforts to assist the countries of the region in the endeavor to eliminate poverty and to return to the path of promoting economic growth and social justice. We reiterate our commitment to the goals endorsed in the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Russia stands ready for honest cooperation with all partners to stop the destructive course of events in our southern neighborhood. We pursue an open policy and do not have any hidden agenda. And as Fyodor Dostoevsky said, I quote, "A policy of honor and unselfishness is not only the highest, but maybe also the most profitable policy for a great nation, just because this policy is great." I thank you, and I'm ready to take your questions.
Thank you, Minister, for your very interesting remarks. Clearly, the Russian Federation views and intentions concerning also the Mediterranean are crucial. So I'm sure that your comments have been listened to with great interest and that we shall have questions from the floor. I see too many hands. I warn you, the Minister has a limited time, and I have already a few people who have asked to put questions. So I would ask first, I certainly take note, I see there Mr. Greco from RAI, but I will come back, please. Can you give me a microphone?
Thank you very much. Minister Lavrov, you were talking about collective coordinated efforts, and you don't see these efforts. My question is, what do you want to see these efforts? Meaning, what can be done to build some trust between you, Russia, and the other allies of this war against terrorism? Starting from United States, obviously, and Italy, and maybe starting from the big problem of Ukraine. That's my question, my first question. Thank you.
Well, I think, well, it looks more like a press conference than interactive dialogue, but what to do? I'm used to it. I think we have to be honest with each other, and we have to be clear about our priorities. Speaking of terrorism, if our priority is defeating terrorism, then we must put aside everything which is secondary, like we did during World War II, when ideological differences were huge between the communist Soviet Union and the capitalist imperialist West, but all these ideologies were put aside and the coalition was created. Yes, it was not easy from the very beginning, but Lend-Lease was coming before the Second Front was opened. And the same approach we need now, when nothing should stay in the way of uniting our efforts efficiently to defeat ISIL and the like. By nothing I mean be it regime change, be it trying to strengthen somebody's geopolitical positions in the region, expanding territories silently and quietly, or having any other political or geopolitical goal. Defeat terrorism. And in practical terms, when the American coalition was announced a year and a half ago, almost, September of last year I think, we clearly stated that it was a mistake not to go to the Security Council, that it was a mistake to go to Baghdad for consent, but not to go to Damascus. I talked to my colleague and he told me, well, we cannot do this, Assad's regime is illegitimate. But it was legitimate only 1 year before that, when we all needed chemical disarmament of Syria, and the Security Council perfectly well adopted resolutions welcoming the decision of the Syrian government, not the regime, but the Syrian government, in joining the Chemical Weapons Convention. And then, when this deal was sealed for 1 year plus several months in The Hague, in the headquarters of the Organization on Chemical Weapons, OPCW anyway, the ambassadors of Russia, United States, Syrian Arab Republic, and the head of the Secretariat of this OPCW, almost on a daily basis, were meeting and discussing how, in practical terms, to implement the chemical disarmament endorsed by the Security Council resolution. And the government in Syria was perfectly legitimate. Immediately after this chemical disarmament was over, it became illegitimate. I believe that terrorism is no less a threat than chemical weapons. And we could be more realistic and less ideological in combining our efforts in fighting it. I told John Kerry, I told my Italian friends, I have no single doubt that had the Americans come to the Security Council, the Council would have been in a position to develop a resolution which would authorize the use of force both in Iraq and in Syria, and will do this in the way which would not have created any discomfort to those who, for one reason or another, preferred not to cooperate with the Syrian government. It's absolutely within diplomatic reach, within the reach of diplomatic science and art. What we have now is a reality, and the coalition led by the Americans, they started by conducting something which I call a strange war. There was one strange war in Europe in the late 30s, last century, and what the coalition was doing was not very clear from the point of view of military experts, from the point of view of politicians. ISIL, just like when ISAF stayed in Afghanistan for 10 years, when it was leaving, the drug industry increased its production capacity, I think, more than 10 times. By the same token, as the coalition had worked for 1 year in Iraq and Syria, the ISIL expanded its territories. Yes, some key sites were liberated, but all in all, the territory expanded. And oil business, illegal oil trade, continued absolutely uninhibited. And that's why when we received the request from the Syrian government, we took the decision which we took, and we started working on the targets according to the intelligence information we were possessing, and we started hitting the backbone of ISIL financial basis, including the oil and oil refineries and the trucks which were moving oil abroad. And it was only after that that the coalition started doing the same. Now they all say, let's close the Syrian-Turkish border. They demand Turkey, to take steps to make sure that this border is closed and not as porous as it is both directions for the bad people and bad stuff moving in and out. So we did influence, I believe, the coalition this way. Our preference is not to compete with the coalition, who is more eager to be a genuine anti-terrorist fighter. Our preference is to coordinate with them. And that's what we proposed to the Americans as the leaders of the coalition from the very beginning. They accepted only what they call deconfliction memorandum to avoid unintended incidents, and relevant procedures were developed, which they committed themselves to make the procedures for all members of the coalition. Unfortunately, it didn't help on the 24th of November, when the Turkish aircraft shot down our bomber on a counter-terrorist mission, the bomber which had no threat vis-à-vis Turkish state at all. But these procedures did not work. I hope they would be much more vigorously employed now, and the Americans, as the leaders of the coalition, promised to make sure that this is the case. But we were not satisfied with just the confliction alone. We proposed the exchange of intelligence information. We proposed the exchange of targets, the exchange of information as to the patriotic non-terrorist opposition locations so that it could be spared by the strikes. And the US told us that it is not ready. They said as soon as we resolve the Assad problem, then we can start genuine coordination. I believe this is a mistake, because this, if you think of it, this means that because of Assad, they allow ISIL to expand. Yes, I know the problems with President Assad some regional countries have. We believe that his fate can only be resolved by the Syrian people themselves. This is what's written in the Vienna documents, and the regional countries, all of them, are committed to this communique. Yes, we are in favor. We understand that there must be political reform, that there must be a new constitution drafted jointly by the government representatives and the opposition, the group to be agreed by them. And yes, we believe that early elections, including presidential elections, should be considered by the Syrians. That's the advice which the outside players, combined in the Syria support group, included in the document adopted in Vienna. But to say that we can only command the support of all coalition members when Assad is gone, and until that we would be, quite choosy as to the means of fighting ISIL and other terrorists, I think it's a huge mistake. And that's why I believe it was kind of progress when we agreed to move in practical terms, to identify terrorist groups, and to help the United Nations assemble an opposition delegation for negotiations with the government. And if these two homeworks are done, I believe we can meet even next week as a serious support group to endorse this approach. And then the United Nations would convene Syrian negotiations, and then it would be possible to discuss a ceasefire, from which, of course, the terrorist groups, the list of which has to be agreed, would be totally exempted. And then we would, I hope, we would not have any pretexts not to go in real coordination against the terrorist groups. You mentioned Ukraine also, and so just to say that by the same token as we need to implement Geneva Communique and the Vienna documents, by the same token we have to implement Minsk agreements. When our Western friends say, Geneva Minsk agreements must be implemented, and then we would lift sanctions imposed on Russia. We're not asking for sanctions lifting. We're working on the Minsk agreement implementation because we don't want to see the continued crisis, deep crisis of Ukrainian state, and we want this country to be healthy and to be free of nationalistic, elements ruling the government and running the show. We want the national reconciliation between all faith and all ethnic groups in Ukraine. And the Minsk agreement, if you read it, has a lot of things, naming the government in Kyiv, which has to do several steps. And the first and immediate step, as the Minsk agreement goes, is to consult with the territories in Donbass on a law to hold local elections. This has to be started in April, according to the Minsk agreements. It has not started yet. And when the Normandy 4 leaders met in Paris on the 2nd of October, they clearly agreed on a package as regards the political process. There must be agreement with this region on the local elections. There must be amnesty. There must be law on special status of these territories, because otherwise people would not know for what kind of competence they vote for the candidates to local authorities. And this special status must be embodied in the constitution by way of introducing the language which Chancellor Merkel personally wrote in the Minsk agreement. The right for the Russian language to be used in these territories, the right to be consulted and to give consent to the appointment of prosecutors, judges, the right to have local police force, some other things. And if you read the Minsk agreements, the Ukrainian government is written all over it. And the need to get agreement of the Donbass people is all over the language. So I feel that it is much better understood now in Europe and in the United States, for that matter, that it is Kyiv government which must also be pushed. Of course, we can influence Donbass, and it was on our insistence that the Donbass accepted the Minsk agreement and signed the Minsk agreement. By signing this, the Donbass committed themselves to territorial integrity of Ukraine, provided Ukraine delivers on its commitment to give this special status to these territories. It's as simple as that.
Many thanks, Minister. Not to consolidate the impression of the press conference, which indeed the Minister has underlined earlier on, I'll give now the floor to a different person, to Dr. Robin Niblett, who is the director of Chatham House. If you give him the...
Thank you very much, and thank you, Foreign Minister, for joining us today. You were noting that the talks in Vienna are making progress, and you talked a little bit about how you saw things playing out from here on. But could I bring you to one issue specifically, which is the likely security situation during the process of negotiations, how to manage that security situation, how to make sure that during a transitional period it doesn't become more violent. Would you accept, or could you envisage in the Vienna negotiations, accept coalition forces, including the United States and others that are partners, providing air protection over areas where the Syrian government's writ has not currently run? In other words, would there be a situation where perhaps Russian-backed and government forces would protect a certain part of the country, and coalition forces, certainly in the air, perhaps even some on the ground, might protect the other? Or would you fear this would lead to the kind of breakup of the country, as you've noted in your remarks? So I'm particularly interested in knowing how you see the security protection for the ongoing negotiations playing out. Thank you.
Is it Chatham House rules or what?
I'll let you take a guess in the room.
Yeah, I think we are making progress, and I believe this is proven by the fact that we adopted 2 documents, which were consensus documents by all key outside players, including quite serious regional protagonists. They were all at the table, and they all endorsed the language, including the language stating very clearly that it is for the Syrian people to decide the future of Syria. They all endorsed the appeal to the United Nations to launch negotiations between the Syrian government and the joint delegation of the opposition. And they all said that it would be good that as a target date in 6 months or something, there could be inclusive, non-sectarian governance, which might be some kind of a government of national unity, to be authorized to draft a constitution and to hold elections. And they all agreed that all in all, in 18 months, approximately as a target, the political process should end in elections. And they also agreed, all of them, that Stefan de Mistura should be the coordinator of the efforts to compile a delegation of the opposition, and that Jordan should be asked to coordinate the terrorist list, which is not easy, of course, but the basic agreements have been reached. It is now important to see how these 2 particular elements of the homework are going to be implemented, because for the next meeting of the Syria Support Group, we can certainly agree if this group would endorse both the approach to terrorists and the approach to the delegation of the opposition, which immediately would give de Mistura the green light to convene the Syrian political process. As for the military aspect of your question, you know, it will be, we have the legal basis for operating in the Syrian airspace. And the fact that the Americans, as the leaders of their coalition, signed a memorandum on deconfliction with us means that they recognize this. And this would be the basis for any further coordinated efforts. As I said, if and when it comes to the moment when coalition is genuinely ready, not to be burdened by some secondary considerations of some of its members, to coordinate anti-terrorist efforts, it would not be too difficult, militarily and diplomatically, to arrange for this scheme which would be legitimate, which would be acceptable to all, including the Syrian government. But we have to start discussing it and not, I would say, jump the gun, including the hints that there must be some split of division of Syria. We are against it. There would need to be some provisions in a new constitution providing more serious, more firm guarantees for the ethnic groups and religious groups in Syria. But there must be no schemes, you know, to divide the country. And the Syria Support Group, the Vienna Group, pronounced itself very strongly in favor of sovereign and territorially integral Syria.
Thank you, Minister. We have time only for two questions, and I have a think tanker and a journalist. I will give now the floor to the journalist, who is Franco Venturini, but warning him that this is not a press conference. So bear this in mind. Can you give the microphone to Franco, please? Franco Venturini from the Corriere della Sera.
Signor Ministro, I have two short questions about Libya. First, can you confirm, obviously on the basis of your information, that in the past 2 or 3 weeks, or perhaps a little more, Daesh presence in Libya has expanded quite a lot? Second part of the question, if the negotiation to form a unity government in Libya somehow succeeds, we'll be going to the UN, to the Security Council. Do you think that we'll be heading towards a resolution on a sort of civil support for the new Libyan government, or perhaps, since your consensus is essential, perhaps there could be a different sort of resolution, for instance under Chapter 7, that could envisage also the use of force against Daesh or against other groups, armed militias in Libya? Thank you.
Well, on the first question, there is conflicting information coming on the actual presence of ISIL in Libya. Some say that ISIL is building up a stronghold in Sirte and even planning to use it as a second capital after Raqqa. Some believe that the available data does not corroborate this firmly. I don't exclude that ISIL is exaggerating the actual expansion, because this structure is a special animal. Unlike other terrorist organizations, they really aim at creating a quasi-state, and they need to sustain the image that they are making progress. As I said, they announced that the caliphate should stretch from Portugal to Pakistan, and they have to demonstrate their success for them to be able to continue keep the ideological image which allow them to recruit more and more supporters. As for the Libyan conference and Libyan settlement, we agree. We discussed today with my good friend Paolo Gentiloni, and also I touched this item with President Mattarella, that it is up for the Libyans eventually to have an inclusive dialogue. And the international community must create conditions for this dialogue and to be fair, to be inclusive, and to push the parties, towards some kind of a compromise. It is impossible to resolve this issue from outside. By the way, we tried this in Yemen, where all outside players basically agreed, and the outside players included the United States, Europe, Russia, the regional countries, and the plan was presented to the Yemeni parties, and eventually they accepted it or acquiesced with this plan, some of them. But it was not a plan which they themselves devised on a compromise basis, on the basis, give and take. It was a plan reflecting how the outside players see a preferable solution to Yemeni crisis. And this fact alone, that it was not a Yemeni-led and Yemeni-agreed document, but kind of a document with which they acquiesced, is the reason why this plan didn't work and why we have what we have now in Yemen. The deal was not considered as fair by some Yemeni parties. And we cannot repeat this mistake in Libya, I hope so. Because what I hear is that some ideas provide for ignoring the people who have been chosen as leaders in Tobruk and as leaders in Tripoli, and to pull the carpet out of them, from under them, and by way of composing like-minded groups in Tripoli and Tobruk alike, and declaring these two groups the healthy force of Libyan settlement, and all others should be outcast. There are even attempts, to throw in the discussion an idea of sanctioning all those who would not accept this. It's a very risky way. In general, when sanctions are used immediately to substitute diplomacy, at any situation when your ideas are not supported, it's wrong. It's wrong in Yemen, as it was proven. It's wrong in other situations, like South Sudan, for example, the country which was created, how, and then some leaders of this country were not behaving according to the design of those who strongly supported the divorce of the two Sudans, and immediately sanctions. We are losing culture of negotiations. We are losing culture of persuasion. We are losing culture of diplomacy and culture of compromise. And this should not be allowed to happen in Libya.
Thank you, Minister. The representative of the think tank who had booked herself for a question has declared herself satisfied with the answers just heard. So for the final question, I see several hands risen. Yes, you had already asked before. Can you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Alaoun, Member of Parliament from Lebanon.
From Lebanon?
Lebanon, yes. Excellency, how can you reconciliate two logics? You can get on board the anti-Assad coalition for more engagement in a more serious and efficient war, not a strange war like you said. But at the same time, bring them on board and not serving their own goal, which is consolidating Assad regime by helping on removing ISIS. Which means, how can we solve this dilemma of you saying you cannot, just for remove a man from power, accept terrorist organization to keep expanding and not fighting it seriously, and them saying just for you to keep one man in power and not allowing us, or not bringing them on board for fighting these terrorists. They are saying that this is the idea.
Yeah, if I understood you right, I can say the following. We agreed in the Vienna process and in Geneva Communique, by the way. And speaking of Geneva Communique of 30th June 2012, immediately after we negotiated this language and endorsed this language, for 8 or 9 hours actually, we, Russia, made sure that the Assad government, a few days later, acquiesced with this document. The opposition never did. We brought this document to the Security Council and suggested a very straightforward resolution endorsing the Geneva Communique. Our Western friends who participated in negotiating the Geneva Communique said, no, this is not enough. I said, why? They said, because the Geneva Communique doesn't say that Assad must go, and it doesn't say that if he does not, then there would be sanctions of the Security Council. I said, yes, it doesn't say so. But this is the consensus which we reached. And all P5 members, Arab League, Turkey, it was a very representative group of countries. And the very participants, from the P5, who were part of this consensus, refused to endorse it. Eventually, it was endorsed more than 1 year later, when we were adopting the resolution on chemical weapons in Syria. And then we added the second part of this resolution, which endorsed Geneva Communique. And it doesn't say that, you know, somebody must go. The Geneva Communique and the Vienna documents, they say that ISIL, and so does, by the way, the resolution which the French introduced, and it was adopted by consensus after the terrorist attack in Paris, that ISIL and Nusra and others to be designated by the Syria support group are enemies and are fair game. You know, as for the question which is about glass half full or half empty, and which comes first, and the chicken and egg, you know, in Geneva Communique and in the Vienna document, we clearly stated that state structures must remain intact. Yes, there should be, as Geneva Communique goes, that there should be a transitional governing organ or inclusive governance, as the Vienna document says. But Geneva Communique says that this transitional governing organ must be composed on the basis of mutual consent of the government and the opposition. And when people say, when they were delaying, we were insisting on starting some negotiations when, you know, Geneva II failed. It failed because the opposition was not representative. It was just national coalition. No one else was invited, but we still were ready to give it a try. Because you never know unless you try. When people say mutual consent means Assad would have a veto. Yes, but opposition also would have a veto. And we would never know whether they can deal until they sit down and start serious discussions. Geneva II was not serious discussion. It was launched by a huge conference, 55 ministers, cameras all over the place. And this type of atmosphere is good for you know, antagonizing positions, not bringing them closer through a quiet dialogue. So Assad is commander-in-chief. People say the Sunni majority in Syria hate him. If this is the case, go for early elections and defeat him in elections if he runs. But to say that you want to keep the structures intact, and at the same time saying that the commander-in-chief must go because otherwise some people would not fight ISIL as well as they should, I believe is irresponsible. We already have been through many situations when the fate of one man was obsession of some people. Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, Yanukovych, by the way. Look at what happened to all these countries when the international community was saying, remove this guy because corruption, because dictatorship, and so on and so forth. And the countries would be blooming and prospering. All these three countries are in much worse shape than they used to be before the regime change. So we hope that we all would learn from this experience. And as I said, we have to make our choices, like we did when the anti-Nazi coalition was formed. Priorities must come first. Of course, anti-Nazi coalition did not prevent Winston Churchill to pronounce his Fulton speech. And then it reflected that after the defeat of the enemy, they came back to their original priorities. But it was pragmatic. And what is going on now with this reluctance to fight the common evil in genuine until Assad is gone is not pragmatic. It's highly ideological. Gentlemen, ladies, I have to thank you wholeheartedly.
Yes, thank you.